let's dive into this morning's passage. So we're now in Acts chapter 17, moving on in the story through, still going through, of course, Paul's second missionary journey. We've now moved on from Philippi to the next stop along the journey, here in Thessalonica, the eponymous, to whom the eponymous letters to the Thessalonians are written. So we're looking at verses 1 to 9 this morning, and so let me read to you first off, and then we'll commence from there. So, all right. Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. Now when they had travelled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. According to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and setting before them that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, "This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a great multitude of God-fearing Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous, taking along some of the wicked men from the marketplace, and forming a mob, set the city into an uproar. And attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out of the assembly. And when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, These men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them. And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And they disturbed the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received the bond from Jason and the others, they released them. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So this, again in a fairly typical fashion, is Luke selectively giving a part of the recounting of this story. If the entire book of Acts were to be recounting like a daily travel log, all of these various journeys, it'd be an unfathomably and insanely long book. In 9 verses, he's covering obviously kind of their arrival in Thessalonica and a particular event which kind of caused their moving on from Thessalonica. So it's kind of bookending it. This is why, and you'll see this when you go through the passage, but this passage of these 9 verses of their time in Thessalonica demonstrate why it's important to always use the broader text of Scripture to interpret Scriptures. Okay, so you should never just take something in isolation. Otherwise, you will often miss context, especially not when you've got 2 other letters called the letter to the Thessalonians. You should always attempt to read using Scripture to interpret Scripture, right? Reading things in context requires looking at more than just the one sentence you've got before you or the passage or whatever happens to be. You have to read more broadly. So you'll see that as we go through, and I'll point out why that's the case. So let's begin in verse 1. So now when the group, had travelled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Now Thessalonica, I pointed this out when they were crossing over into Macedonia as a region, into Macedonia. City of Philippi, named after Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. Thessaloniki, named after eponymously the half-sister of Alexander the Great. At this particular juncture, Thessaloniki was the provincial capital of the Roman province of Macedonia, and so it was the largest city in northern Greece, and still to this day is the second largest city in Greece outside of Athens. Got a population of probably about 1 million people roughly. So it's a very historic city, very important city, and was, as I said, the provincial capital in this time. And so this was a large city, significant city, and they're moving. And this is the the whole point of their journey through Greece broadly anyway. They go to the major places, like especially by the time we get through the end of their time in Greece, Athens and Corinth. Very strategic decisions. And so they've travelled through Amphipolis and Apollonia. That should be taken, broadly speaking, as probably a journey. When it says travelled through those places, it really should be probably taken as travelled through, as opposed to, I mean, obviously they would have stopped along the way, but there's no necessary reason to think textually that they then stopped and then they planted a church in those cities. It appears, at least textually, the way it reads, and this is the way that the church has taken it, that they're moving through those cities, which are on the road to Thessaloniki. Obviously, over then time, the job of the Thessalonians would have been to then send their own people to Amphipolis and Apollonia to plant churches, and that's exactly what happened as time kind of rolls on from the first century onward. But they arrive in Thessaloniki, a very important city.
Can I raise a point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Some time ago, when I was thinking about Thessaloniki, I thought, just go straight to Athens, Paul.
Yeah.
What's the point? Why are you doing the borders, so to speak? You know, he's done this enormous arc, and then he goes to Athens.
Yeah.
Why not go to Athens in the first place?
And then radiate out from there, yeah.
But the Lord purposed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why? Why would the Lord prefer outliers to the hub?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole, that's a very good question, which many people have tried to talk about. Yeah, because it's not necessarily like, it's not a, your point's 100% correct. It's not going directly to the proverbial heart of Greece, Athens herself, and then branching out from there. It's also not completely, like, it's not like the country road beaten, you know, the off the beaten path type of deal. It's not like a ridiculous journey, like a really odd journey they're taking per se, especially not traveling from Troas to Philippi up in Macedonia.
True, but Berea is Berea
is, that's what I was about to say, but the Berea is kind of just out of the way.
But there was a synagogue there.
Yeah, exactly.
Which begs another question.
Berea is the only surprising part of the journey. Yeah.
Why would Jews from the diaspora, who are forced to be traders, so they've left the Holy Land some time ago, so they're no longer agrarian.
Hundreds of years ago, probably, for them, yeah.
They're now merchant class.
Correct, definitely they were.
Why on earth would such a Jew not stay in the middle of Athens, where there's heaps of people, heaps of trade?
The most important agora.
Why would they go in the middle of nowhere? I've been to Berea, it's mountainous, it's just goat tracks.
Yeah. Good old Vedar is nothing. Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's nothing impressive at all, and never really was. Yeah, exactly. Then again, why do people move anywhere?
I'm saying that it's better. By the way, Berea is in beautiful landscape.
Oh, the whole countryside's beautiful.
Just stunning. The north of Greece is really
beautiful. It's gorgeous. Yeah,
stunning. And so they were seeking high places. They were seeking to be closer to God. I think they eschewed.
Simple lives.
They avoided Athens spiritually on purpose.
Correct. Yeah, that would be exactly. Many of the places, exactly. It's kind of the majority of the diaspora during the Hellenistic period. The diaspora occurs when Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire roll through in the 330s. They conquer Jerusalem in 332, and then you have the Macedonian Empire, the Greek Empire, to use a not quite correct term, that then divides up after Alexander into the Diadochi, the successors, where the empire is divided into 4 successor kingdoms or 4 successor empires. Jerusalem came under the dominion of the Seleucid Empire and the Seleucid emperors, and eventually that's where the books of Maccabees come from. They're Judeo-canonical, so they're not biblical, but they provide a good historical insight from the 2nd century into the war against Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid emperor. But the various other places were then divided up. Ptolemaic Egypt, this is where the Ptolemies come from. So eventually figures like the last Ptolemy, which was Cleopatra essentially. And yes, the empire's divided up. But as the Alexandria or the Macedonian Empire exists, and then the successors, Jews disperse all around, especially after the war with the Seleucid rulers. That's when one of the major diasporas occur, where they flee Jerusalem because of the war going on, and a lot of people land around the eastern half of the world because of that. And so it was driven by survival for the large part. Most did move to cities. That's why by the time you get into Acts chapter 2, at Pentecost, and you've got that list of Jews who have come from all around the world for the Feast of Booths, right, for Pentecost. They're from, those are all major, varying levels of significance, but those are all cities. Do you know what I mean? That they're coming from. They're not backwater places. And so, but Veroa is, I'm not trying to agree, is essentially a backwater in one sense. It's a country place.
No, it is.
It's there's nothing significant about it.
It doesn't have plains. It's on a cliff.
It's all mountainous.
It's on the side of a
Correct.
mountain.
That's my point. Yeah. It's nothing compared to Athens. And so so why would people move there? Really, it's probably the desire to move away from the hustle and bustle of the mercantile city life. Finding solitude in the country.
And the pollution of the Greek pantheon.
I was about to say that. Yeah, that was my next point. Is that Jews would not have found naturally a pleasing home to arrive in Corinth. In Corinthia. Yeah.
There's an irony and a paradox in what you just said, because we know from Scripture that there were many, many, many Jews who were Hellenized.
Yeah.
So why would Jews be Hellenized? That's a
whole other issue. Yeah, correct.
But there were other Jews who didn't want to be Hellenized.
Yeah, exactly. Various levels of exactly 100% correct. Yeah. There was plenty of Jews that practically they were practically honorary Greeks by this point, where they were, I say it kind of tongue in cheek.
Well, they intermarried.
They intermarried.
If you look at the Greek surnames list today,
exactly correct. That's
Avramidis, Abramides.
Midis, yeah, correct, yeah.
Simonson.
Exactly.
I mean, please.
All of those are correct. Exactly. They're all Judaic names. They're all Hebrew names. Yeah. Exactly right. And so, but either way, it's kind of the only way. I mean, I could start trying to draw a parallel, but all I'd be doing was throwing in all kinds of speculations, like. The journey that they make is very similar to the journey that the Persians made under Xerxes when they invaded Greece, but again, that doesn't really give you much information. That's called drawing a longbow, to put it nicely. And so you could try and figure some typological sense. Macedonia is still of significance here. Don't get me wrong, Athens is still atop the pinnacle. Sparta is nothing. All of Laconia is nothing. Argos is nothing. That's why they don't go there. They were historically, but not by this point.
But even so, in Thessalonica, it says in my version, where there was a synagogue of the Jewish people.
It is our synagogue.
One synagogue.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
So it couldn't have been that big a hub.
No, not in terms of the Jewish public, no, definitely not. And so, it's definitively a singular one that seems to be what's in view here. And that was not uncommon.
It's very interesting.
There's plenty of places where they go to where it's just, there's this, and they're not even usually, well, like we had with Philippi. Philippi had such a small Jewish population, there wasn't even enough for a synagogue. They didn't have the minimum requirement of the 10 men that they needed to have to form their synagogue, which is a human tradition if there ever was one. But nonetheless, this is where the Jews are up to, unfortunately. And so they can't even form a synagogue, so they're meeting by a riverside, basically in Philippi. That's what it is. Yeah.
And I think we've answered the point I raised earlier. Which is why Paul went there. Even though there was one synagogue in Thessaloniki and one synagogue in Veria, they were devout. Yeah,
they were committed. Yeah, and that's probably maybe even because of the lack of numbers. You know what I mean? That would have been the essence of their community. Well, it's like, you know as well as I would, that for ethnically Greek people in Australia, what's the centre point of community? The church. The church is the centre point of the community. It's the maintenance of their language. It's the maintenance of culture. It's the maintenance of everything.
Interestingly, there's a stark parallel between that which you just said, applicable, by the way, for the last 2,000 years throughout the Greek-speaking world.
Correct, yeah.
The hub was the church. And the same applies to the Jews and the synagogue.
Yeah, correct. That's my point, yeah. Exactly.
Go to any city, go to Bondi on a Saturday morning.
It's the maintenance of their culture, yeah. It's the centre point. And that's not even necessarily, well, the maintenance, like let's just say with the Greeks and the church, it can become an issue if it's unbridled, and it's not the only Greeks. The same thing would go for the Russians, the Serbs, the Armenians. It goes for anyone. It goes for Italians. It goes for anyone. It can become a problem if the ethnic identity of the church becomes more pragmatically important than the actual proclamation of the gospel itself. To all the nations, if that becomes, and because that can be a problem, and it often sometimes is, and so that's just something that needs to be reined in. But even broadly speaking, though, the issue though isn't that's a problem. The basis though of the church being the centre point of community, not only is that not the problem, that's actually the good part. Okay, because throughout Western history over the last 2,000 years, that's been the whole point. The church has been the centre point of people's lives. You wonder why people are struggling so much with. Especially younger people, millennials, and especially my generation, Gen Z, are struggling so much with they're just drowning in purposelessness, meaninglessness. They're drowning in a sense of nihilism where nothing means anything anymore. Because what are communities? Do you know what I mean? The Katoomba would be obviously on a per capita basis would be more communally based, more communally minded than your average suburb in Sydney. But even still up here, in a place like Katoomba, which would be more communally minded, this is not some tight-knit community. Do you know what I mean? Not at all. People just live here, right? For the most part. So then that's the better case scenario. Let alone when you go into a suburb in Sydney and there's no such thing as community because you all actually just live in a giant housing estate, like a giant housing block that we call the suburbs. No one works there. No one shops there because the shops aren't there. The workplaces are not there. It's all just housing. That's one of the disastrous things about suburban housing, is it actually destroys community, not the other way around. Because people don't build community because they happen to live on a plot of land next to someone. Community is built around centre points of human interaction, church, marketplace, the town square, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like things that are actually institutional, right? Especially the church. And that's not how we've been doing it for decades now. Instead, we've built up, because of financial greed, primarily, we've built up suburbs and the concept of suburbia. And everyone shoots off to go work somewhere else. They go shop somewhere else. They go to church somewhere else. As opposed to the church being the centre point of community, everyone would go to church at different times, but they'd go multiple times a week, often every day. The marketplace was in the village or the town, whatever happens, whatever level of size you are, right? This place, that place. Your work. Guess where you work? Yeah.
Yeah, I was acutely aware of this. When I was 12 years old.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's and where did most people work? They did the concept of for the vast majority of human, like 99+% of human history, people didn't work an hour and a half away from where they lived. Because they didn't even, not only did they not work 90 minutes away, they didn't even work 90 seconds away. Because all it takes is about 10 seconds to walk up a flight of stairs or down the stairs because they worked where they lived. You know what I mean? The blacksmith has his, speaking of an example, the blacksmith has his store and then he lives on the second floor. The farmer lives on the farm, right? The tanner, the carpenter, etc. They work, and that's where the village is. So people are living and working in their village or in their town or in their part, wherever, or in their part of the city, whatever happens to be, right? Whatever the size of a place you're living in, and that breeds community. The way we've been doing it for the better part of 50+ years of the rise of suburbia, it's not just like, oh, this is a little problem. No, it's a disastrous problem. It inherently erodes and destroys the very fabric of community.
You actually raised something that's fascinating. You raised the
and no one talks about it.
Urbanisation of peoples.
Yeah.
And that really started in England.
Yes, correct.
It started really nowhere else.
No, correct. It was born out of the Industrial Revolution.
Out of the Industrial Revolution.
When people now, and that's the first time now, with the Industrial Revolution in particularly England and Wales, but in the United Kingdom broadly, this is the first time where now on a mass level, certainly at least, because you always had specialists, like you always had the doctor or the lawyer who went off to you always had the professor, the scholar. That's all good and well. That's
the priest.
Yeah, exactly. The priest, the minister. That's always perfectly fine. Right? That's always been the case. I'm talking about the bulk of people, the commons, right, the working class, right, which is great. But that's what it was. Now this was the first time that the commons, right, the everyday man, now got up of a morning, left the house and travelled off to the coal mine, the factory, the city. Yeah, that's the first time. So it's the Industrial Revolution. We think of the Industrial Revolution. No, we think of everyone's been taught the Industrial Revolution was that there was nothing remotely bad or wrong about the Industrial Revolution. And don't get me wrong, the Industrial Revolution produced many good things. The problem is that no one talks about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, because we can get really good things, but at what cost?
It fundamentally changed the groupings in society.
Exactly, and the Industrial Revolution is what I point to as the first step in the breakdown of the family. It's not the rise of feminism, which is a problem on an ideological level. It's not even early things like universal suffrage. People think that's a broadly universal thing, but it itself debases the concept of family. It was always, as a basic principle, for starters, landowners, so someone who actually had literally a vested interest in how society actually operates, because they have a stake in the game. But even that part aside, it was one vote. People often mischaracterize it as, only men can vote. It wasn't an issue of the man, it was the household. So there was one vote per household. It's unfair to just categorize that as a man, because the idea that he never talked to his wife about politics is ludicrous, right? It was a household, right? It was one domicile. And the premise of that was that the family's united, because if me and my wife have two completely different political philosophies, we've got a real problem. Do you understand? That shouldn't be difficult to figure out. Because the politics is an outworking of our entire worldview, what we think is good for society, what we think morality is, how we think the law and order should work. That's all that all flows into politics.
And by the way,
it's a big deal.
Those voting gentry that you're talking about, they had masses of people under them, as it were.
Correct.
To whom they were responsible.
Absolutely responsible.
They provided the work for the people on the land.
The land as tenancy. Yep.
They provided the food on the table. They provided the moral guidance. They provided everything.
Correct.
And they took it very seriously indeed.
Oh yeah, exactly. The stereotype of the kind of Scrooge McDuck baron that's just floating around in a pile of money. That merely describes when landed gentry became evil and when they didn't do their job properly. But that's the case in you can always point to a stereotype of when someone doesn't do their job properly. That doesn't then describe the fundamental good of the actual position, because it's a failure. It's a complete caricature that's really actually driven by envy. Oh, why shouldn't I be the one who owns the land? Why shouldn't? But what's ironic is that as we sit here in the 21st century, saying the reason why that was bad and why we need to get rid of it was because how dare they think they're better than us, blah blah. Meanwhile, your ancestors who actually lived in, even going all the way back to proper feudalism, like medieval feudalism, weren't sitting around whinging about it. They all were perfect en masse. Were perfectly good with it, because A, it worked, B, it was mutually. The nobility has always known.
There was a
we die if we mistreat the commons. Are you kidding me? They're the ones who put food on our table. Food on their own tables. They're the ones. They're the bedrock of the community. They took care of their people. They took care of tenants. That's how it worked. But it's driven out of a sense of why shouldn't I have blah blah. But as soon as you're thinking along those lines, you're now already well on the path of envy. It's on the path of bitterness. And it's just driven by a complete lack of historical understanding, that there was no social mobility. Of course, there's social mobility. People sent their kids to be trained up as something else all the time. Happened all the time.
Well, the cruel irony in all of it is that the result of atomisation, the result of individual land ownership, has resulted in the breakdown and the failure of meaningful social networks and relationships.
Yes, 100%.
And now you've got
gigantic contributor.
Isolation, depression, anxiety at levels unprecedented in human history.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the consequence exactly right. We got microwaves and 2-minute noodles, but at what cost? Do you understand? And it's not much. I'm not trying to be trite or trivial about it. Don't get me wrong. There's been some of the great advances in medicine, like life-saving things. No one's disparaging that those are somehow bad or that those are somehow evil. That's not the issue, though. The issue is, again, we get X, Y, and Z, but at what cost? And the fact that we're not even willing to discuss what the cost may or may not be, that's the problem, right? Because becoming wealthy and luxurious is nice, but at what cost? Right? At what cost? So let's circle back here. So in verse 2, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them, as in referring to the synagogue of the Jews, and for 3 Sabbaths, that is to say 3 Saturdays, right, for 3 weeks in other words, reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and setting before them that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead, saying to them, this Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is that Christ. So there's a number of things here. One, well, the first of which I'll circle back to after we've got through the main point. But he goes to them for 3 weeks, reasons with them from the scriptures. Vitally important point, because again, we've already seen this 1,000 times already throughout Acts. But the starting point and the finishing point of anything that the apostles ever say to people is the scriptures. They're not just giving some nice ideas. They're not giving them some life coaching. They're not explaining to them, here's 3 simple steps to a happier, healthier life. They're showing them from the scriptures, keeping in mind the Bible, or the scriptures at this point, is what today we would just simply call the Old Testament. Okay. They're showing it to them in Greek, because the apostles universally used the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament made during the intertestamental period. So around in the 3rd century BC, around the year 200, roughly speaking. Which is the language that these Hellenistic Jews use. None of them. It's entirely possible that none of them, including any of the rabbis, actually spoke Hebrew. Some of the rabbis might have, but certainly all the people of the synagogue spoke Greek, and they wouldn't have known a lick of Hebrew. And that was fairly common, especially in diaspora places like in Greece. And so they're reasoning to them from the Greek Old Testament, as we would say, and explaining to them from that. And setting before them, in other words, showing them before their very face that the Christ, i.e. the Messiah, the King, again, Christos, the Greek translation of that Hebrew word, Meshiach, meaning the anointed or the King, had to suffer and rise from the dead. And so, I've made this point before, but I'll make it again because it's a similar kind of wording we've seen before. But you can demonstrate the death, burial, and resurrection from just the Old Testament. Do you understand? Obviously, its fruition is the whole point of the New Testament. So we have the historical records of the Gospels, right, for that very purpose, okay? But you can actually demonstrate. So what they're doing is they're demonstrating, and this is why the wording here is pretty intelligent on Luke's part. In verse 3, if you look at the wording there in verse 3, explaining and setting before them that the Christ, the King, right, the Messiah, had to suffer and rise again from the dead. So in other words, showing to them, no, this is exactly what the Messiah was always prophesied to do, and let me tell you about it because I saw it. You know what I mean? So they're using the scriptures as here's the exegetical basis, and that word, I'd love to know what they use for explained there. Let me just have a look in verse 3. Yeah, interesting. The anoiron. Opening, revealing, like opening up to them, is what that's describing. And so it's opening up to them the scriptures, explaining it to them, opening them up, and showing them from scripture. Here's all the things here's the criteria, so it were, for the Messiah, and that's where that's where for the last 2,000 years essentially, including the Jews in Jesus' day. This is where Judaism goes so abhorrently far off the rails, in that their philosophical basis or their theological basis for rejecting the Messiah is because he doesn't meet the criteria. And then you actually get them to explain the criteria, and it's not even the correct criteria. Do you know what I mean? Of what the Messiah was supposedly meant to do. And that's the whole point, is because it is the entire premise of the issue in the first century, and it has been the same issue for 2,000 years now, but was that they're looking forward to the Messiah. This is how staggering this is, by the way, the apostasy in the first century. They know that the Messiah is meant to be coming at this time because of what Daniel had said nearly 500 plus years beforehand. And so they know that this is the first century is the time in which this is meant to occur. That's why what Christians can point to, where you have a prophet like my namesake Daniel, who gives a pretty specific timeline of when the Messiah is meant to be coming. And then you see that that's the exact time that Jesus comes in. And so that's not us playing like hocus pocus. That's us pointing to, well, God has said through this individual, this is what's going to happen. And then it ends up happening. It's like with Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid or the Persian Empire, where Isaiah, a Hebrew prophet, 150 years before he's born, by name says that Cyrus, a Persian, is going to rise and will conquer those whom have conquered Jerusalem. I'm paraphrasing. 150 years. He said, by name says Cyrus. Like you can read the name Cyrus in the Bible 150 years before it happens, and then that is the God. Like it's not the idea of getting around that. Of
the last two prophets, arguably, before Jesus. I mean, Jesus was an infant at the time in the temple. What would Simeon and Anna have done?
Yeah.
They would have gone out and shouted out from the rooftops that he's here.
Yeah.
So the word would have been spread by those prophets.
Correct. And that's why, exactly, and that's also the context in which, by the way, like say, for example, in the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus is talking to those disciples about these things which are, from that time point in his ministry that's soon to unfold, that he's talking about, and many shall say, I am the Christ, and I am the Christ. But that was already going on. That right around, even when Jesus is alive, there are already other people that are calling themselves the Messiah. That's the whole issue. And so that's why you get these interactions. And people, if people aren't reading it in context or considering the history, they sometimes get a bit confused by it. And that's, it's understandable. But other Christs, other Messiahs get made in passing reference, even in the Gospels, where like the Jewish authorities make point about I'm paraphrasing, but the kind of sentiment of, this is just one of another people who are claiming to be the Messiah, because there were other people in Judea more broadly.
But they
in the first
couldn't
century
prove their genealogy.
Correct. That's why the genealogy is so important.
The scroll, the citizenry roll,
exactly,
was in the temple.
Exactly.
They all knew. Everyone knew
Correct.
that the Christ had to be a descendant, a great-great-great-grandson of David.
Of David. Had to be from David. Correct.
Jesus could prove his genealogy.
And it is proven. That's why it's recorded for us. Yeah.
After the Romans burned it all down,
no
one could prove their genealogy.
No one can prove it. Exactly. That's the whole thing. Exactly. The evidence of Jesus being the Messiah that was foretold from the Old Testament, it couldn't be more blindingly obvious. Like, for starters, where do you think Matthew got the genealogical list from? And Luke, for that matter, but in this case Matthew, which is Matthew's is the more typological. So Matthew's is divided into 3 sets of 14 for a specific reason, because of the theological typology of it, the symbolism of it. But it's the same. But where do you think he gets that list from? He didn't just make it up. He wasn't carrying it around in his pocket, was he? No, he got it from the temple. Where do you think Luke got it from?
Everyone could go and research it themselves.
Exactly. The Jews were very finicky over genealogy for that reason, because there were specific things that God had said. This is how you will know that this is the one that I've sent. This is how you know this is the Son of God, and that was for people's benefit, so that it wasn't just some ta-da charlatan guy just rolling up and saying, it's me, guys, trust me. There was actual criteria of who it was meant to be, and Jesus meets the list top to bottom, and so that's why, exactly. And that's why in understanding, it's most people are usually surprised to understand that Judaism is not just kind of Christianity minus the New Testament. That's not at all what it is. Ironically, it's actually younger than Christianity. It's a departure, because the Jews that you think of from the Old Testament, they're the ones that became Christians. That's the apostles. That's Peter. That's John. That's all that. That's who they are.
Here.
Yeah, that's who they are. They're the ones who so this obviously ethnically Jewish. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in terms of the religious element, Judaism is really the codification of all the oral traditions that then end up getting codified under Yehuda the Prince in the late 2nd century AD into things like the Mishnah and the Talmud. They're all the rabbinic teachings, because the Sadducees and the Pharisees get wiped off the face of the earth. They're gone in the destruction of Jerusalem, never to be seen from ever again. The temple's gone. All the genealogies are gone. The scrolls are gone. The whole box and dice. The scriptures laid up in the temple, gone. Well, not gone, but you know what I mean, gone from the temple, because these are the scriptures laid up in the temple. That's how we know what's what. That's how we know what the Old Testament was. And why? Because it all been fulfilled. And so then under this new religion, Judaism, you have to then get a complete reinterpretation of the entire framework. So the sacrificial system gets reinterpreted as prayers, all these things which are just complete, the whole box and dice.
Just as an aside, how we know that Paul was studying under Gamaliel,
correct, yep,
in Jerusalem.
Yep, correct.
How old would Paul have been when Jesus was crucified?
Oh, yeah, I mean, he's a young man, and by young man, it's probably he's somewhere in his 20s when he's persecuting the Christians.
So he would have been
he's probably
in his teens when Jesus was crucified,
yeah,
or
correct.
earlier,
Teens-ish.
but alive.
Oh yeah, obviously.
But alive.
Teens-ish somewhere, yeah.
And he wouldn't have been in a back room reading his scroll on the day on Passover when Jesus was crucified with the two beside him.
Yeah, look, we're not told, but you could better. Yeah.
He would have been an eyewitness.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. That's the Yeah, I mean, even the way he talks about the crucifixion, although we're never ever specifically told in black and writing. And Paul was there and he saw it, because you don't need that at times. It's just you can just connect dots. The way he talks about the crucifixion even kind of gives off an air of, okay, this is someone who saw this. Do you know what I mean? We're never told that specifically, but it's perfectly. But him being he's in Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem at this time period. He's already well on the way of his rabbinic training, all this kind of stuff. It's a perfectly logical. You don't have to believe this. It's like, oh, this is some central dogma of the church. It's entirely possible that he was present at the crucifixion.
He had to have been. He was
and
caught up
in
the tumult. He wanted to see what was going on. Everyone was,
because everyone in Jerusalem did. Yeah, exactly.
Everyone was there.
Yeah, exactly. No one missed the crucifixion of Jesus in Jerusalem.
You weren't knitting. You weren't at home knitting.
No, exactly. No. It was even with things going on. It was the thing going on that day. That's what it was. That's a whole. It was not. No one in Jerusalem.
That's why Jesus on the road to Emmaus, he says, by the way, what's been going on in Jerusalem?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, right.
And they say the two witnesses, the two.
No, they know. It's the talk of the proverbial ten.
What, are you the only one that doesn't know?
Exactly. That's the point. That's the point I'm making. Yeah. So Paul absolutely knew what happened, and it's well within the bounds of possibility. Then that he's present. We have no way of definitively knowing, but it's entirely possible, because even still though, everyone, and even if he wasn't literally standing there watching the crucifixion or watching the trial, he was far more likely to be watching the trial. Like when Jesus is tried and then beaten very publicly and flogged. That's the most likely part.
Because he's a lawyer.
Exactly. That's the part where he's most likely to be present, 100%, because.
And he realised...
It's gigantic crowds that are present when that happens. Yeah.
He would have realised too that the Sanhedrin broke all their own rules.
Yeah.
In the trial.
Correct. Yeah, because in terms of the public event of the crucifixion, and this was the case for any crucifixion. So I'm not just like making something off the top of my head, but the big ticket, the spectacle element was really the trial and the public excoriation, so the public beating. Yeah, that was the public element of it. The crucifixion was just, and they're taken off in the crucifixion. So there's a big crowd when he's carrying the cross up to Golgotha, but there's not a gigantic crowd when because a crucifixion normally lasts days.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus the women would have been just out of what's the word? Decency.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
Shame. They wouldn't have been looking at Jesus naked on the cross.
Yeah, exactly. Naked and dying and beaten to a pulp. Yeah, women didn't generally witness that as participatory, because the crucifixion was just the aftermath. That was really that was basically what it was. It was the aftermath, and as I'm saying, most victims of crucifixion were that would take days. Jesus's crucifixion is actually a very, very short crucifixion by comparative standards, and so. Most people would survive up on a cross for 48 to 72 hours. And eventually, if they hadn't suffocated, because you die by suffocation when you're crucified, because you're, not every time, but most times your shoulders actually end up getting dislocated in the process of nailing you to the crossbeam. And then when all you have is your feet crossed over and nailed through, and you don't have any ability to actually support your diaphragm to be able to breathe. So you have to kind of push yourself up like this, which is obviously even more painful. But if you hadn't suffocated to death yet, then eventually they would, if it was dragging on for too long, they'd then just break your kneecaps and you couldn't push yourself up anymore, and then you'd asphyxiate. So Jesus' crucifixion is very... But again, you want to talk about things that qualify the Messiah or qualify the crucifixion. The Old Testament explicitly says he was pierced through our transgression and that his bones would not be broken. And whereas that the breaking of the bones was a completely normal part of crucifixion. In fact, that's how most it would drag on for however long it needed to be, and then they would break your legs and you couldn't breathe anymore. Okay, that's how you would die. So that was a normal part of crucifixion, right? And the Old Testament very clearly says that his legs, no bones would be broken in his body. Even though he's undergoing all of these horrific things, the evisceration with the whipping, disfigurement, the whole box and dice, the crown of thorns, which a crown, by the way, was probably, well, it could have been a wreath like this, it was probably more like a cap, but those are not tiny little, those are very long, they're driven into, actually hammered into your head.
The Hebrew word for the thorn bush that was used
to... Yeah, brilliant, yeah, correct, go to make this point, it's a good point, yeah.
To harvest the thorns from, is the very same word for the thorn bush that was burning and
in Exodus 3,
they should have known that God was in the thorn bush on the mountain when Moses spoke to him, and God was in the middle of the the thorn of crowns.
Now I'm going to nip that in the bud only because when I start talking about that connection, it turns into an entire sermon. So I'm not going to do it because the typology is really, because it's a thorn bush, and the Hebrew actually makes this really clear that in the Old Testament, when God first appears to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, that it is a thorn bush. I didn't go back and look at the exact Hebrew word, but it's very explicitly a thorn bush. We know this for a fact, okay? And the whole point is that the thorn bush, the thorns being a product of the fall, something that's explicitly mentioned, right, as a sign of the curse of sin that humanity of now bringing evil into the world, that God appears in a thorn bush, but the bush is not consumed by him. Okay, that's actually extremely important. So the thorn bush, the curse of sin, all of that symbology is there, and he's present in this fire, which is a whole God. We often associate fires with destruction and damnation, and that's part of it. But all of that's really, again, typological imagery, because hell is also described as outer darkness, which is, for anyone who knows science and physics, outer darkness is extremely cold, not hot. The heat and light go together, not darkness. And so it's describing destruction, but the point is, fire is actually far more commonly associated with not fire of destruction, but the fire that purifies. Think, for example, an obvious example of this is in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah has a vision of the divine council of the heavenly temple, and you have the appearance of seraphs, so the seraphim, these throne guardians of God. The word seraph means fiery flying serpent, and he takes what from the altar? A burning coal, and puts it on Isaiah's tongue to purify. Again, all that has really significant, that whole event happening to Isaiah is for the broader point of what Isaiah goes on to explain about the purification. And so he says, I'm a man of unclean lips among a people of unclean lips, right? Because of our idolatry and our sin and our blasphemy and our cursing of people and blah, blah, blah. But fire is associated, actually, or ironically, far more often with God, but as a fire, not that it destroys, but a fire that purifies. Right, and that's the entire typology that's going on there in Exodus 3 of God appearing fire in the burning bush, but the bush is not consumed. So the Spirit of God is in the midst and literally enveloping this material thing, but the material is not consumed, which has it's actually pointing towards the incarnation. That's what it's really doing ultimately.
It's actually also
because it's God appearing, the Spirit. It's the divine essence of God, who is Spirit, in and amongst and fully embracing the humanity, which is cursed by sin, the thorns, but yet the humanity is not consumed by him. That's the entire. It's such incredible typology. And when you get to by the time you get to the incarnation and can look back on Exodus 3, it's actually one of my favourite passages to preach on because of that. Yeah, it's brilliant. But anyway, so you were about to say something?
I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes...
Oh, it goes way beyond that. I'm just giving you the cliff notes.
Yeah. You talked about the purification.
Yep. Judgment
Day is for all also a time of purification.
Yeah.
For those going to the left,
quote unquote, yeah,
the goats, it's a death. It's the second.
It's death. A fire that destroys. Yeah.
But for the believer, fire is promised to us as well. It's a very difficult thing for a human
it's a fire that purifies,
to get his mind around.
Correct, yeah. And it's a brilliant point. Yeah, and this gets discussed in the New Testament more often than people would realise. But this is exactly the way that both the early church and the medieval church talked about this, especially the medieval, but as well as the early church. Especially in the medieval period, cosmologically, the term we use the term heaven, and that's a Germanic word in origin. But that the word more commonly used in the medieval period was one of Latin derivation, empyreon. Latin derivation from the Greek, and you would know this. So the color of fire, the color of red, pyros, is used in that word. Empyreon means in the fire, or the place in the fire. And this was the description of where God resides, the empyreon, right? Heaven, the third heaven, the empyreon, meaning in the fire, the place of fire. Not fire that destroys, but the fire that purifies, and fire again associated with light, as opposed to lack of fire, darkness, no light, right? That's the opposite. So they really oppose, and you get this. The most vivid example of this is Dante's Commedia, so Dante's Inferno, Dante's Paradiso. By the time you get to the late medieval period, where Dante writes this great, incredible epic poem. Obviously, I'm not a fan of Purgatorio for theological reasons, but ironically, that's where the idea of purgatory comes from. It's taking a biblical idea and then going off the rails with it, right? So purgatory, which is where we get the purgatoria, which is where we get the word purge from, P-U-R-G-E, purge, is not just created out of thin air. It comes from that concept of all will pass through fire. The fire will destroy those who have rebelled against God and who are outside of Christ. But like you had with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were in the fire but were not destroyed by it, because who was with them? Christ. Right, so Christ appearing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is drawing very clear parallels back to Exodus 3. God in the fire. That's the point that's being drawn there. And because it's the fire that purifies, vis-a-vis Isaiah 6, right? The hot coals from the altar, right, from the place where the sacrifice is made, and that purifies Isaiah. So the fire from the altar of the sacrifice, which was pointing forward to what? The sacrifice of Christ. That sacrifice purifies Isaiah. The sacrifice of Christ purifies us. Do you know what I mean? All of this imagery is pointing forward. It's demonstrating, it's God communicating the reality of things to us. And there's just you can keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper.
In that sense, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Church have done some remarkable intellectualization of this very interesting, fascinating point.
Especially Rome, yeah. Rome's tendency, and don't get me wrong, Protestants are guilty of this at times as well, but on that issue, the West has a far more decisively intellectual basis of the scriptures, and at times that can be good, at times that's been bad. The East tends to be more experiential and mystical in that sense. Mystical, not necessarily even in a bad sense, but mystical, experiential, the mystery of it, right? So, like, if you went to an Eastern Orthodox clergyman and asked him, what do you believe about X, Y, and Z? More times than not, he's going to say, well, come and participate in the Divine Liturgy and you'll find out. So it's actually like the come and see how we pray, how we teach, the creeds, the hymns, etc., blah, blah. So it's more of the experiential side, and that's actually a fairly historical point. It's just a different way of conceptualizing things, and so it's difficult sometimes to talk theology with Eastern compatriots because it's more experiential than it is intellectual.
It's pitiful.
And that's where these disagreements a lot of the time come from. Half the time we're shooting across the bow at each other because we've almost lost the ability to actually have the same language to talk to each other in better conversation theologically.
This point that we've been on for 10 minutes, the purification by fire, which is clearly something that Jesus spoke about.
And the apostles,
And he went through because he was in the burning bush on the mountain with Moses.
Exactly, yes.
That was him.
That's him, yeah. He's the one with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
It's pitiful that even the intellectual arm of evangelical Protestantism is fearful. I'd say fearful to touch on this point because borderline. They don't extrapolate. They don't delve into it. They don't. It's something that they don't touch because it's a mystery. But it's not. It's not a mystery. We're told details about it.
Well, it's a mystery that's been revealed. So Paul uses the word mysterion all the time. He uses the word mystery, and the mystery of the gospel, the primary basis of that mystery is the incarnation. God taking on humanity and being both fully God and fully man. And that has, that's actually one area where the Eastern churches are very heavily focused on the incarnation, and they're right. If anyone tends to downplay it, it's people in the West, especially Protestants, where we've lost a lot of the theological, and I'll explain what I mean by the word mystical, but a lot of the mystical element of it. It's not a mystery because, it's some secret esoteric knowledge. It's a mystery that's been revealed. That's what I'm saying when I say mystical. Make no mistake, the incarnation is mystical. This is the eternal divine God taking on mortal flesh. It's the definition of a mystery, okay? But it's a mystery that's been revealed, right? The Apostle John in his prologue of the gospel, his opening of his gospel in verse 18, which is the whole verse 1 to 18 of John's gospel is what's called the prologue. In verse 18, which is the end of that prologue, that opening, he says that no one has seen God, the only God, who has exegeted him. He actually, like how I'm exegeting the scriptures, the word that John uses is that Jesus, in his incarnation, exegetes God. He reveals God, right? And so that's why Jesus is able to say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Because no one had seen God. No one had seen God, and even Moses, the passing of Moses in the cleft of the rock, that's Moses sort of, kind of, but not really catching a glimpse of pre-incarnate Jesus, right? That's all that is. That's the most that anyone even got remotely close to. Moses seeing the burning bush is actually about as close as it ever got. But even that, again, there's a mystical element to that. But it's revealed to us because that was foreshadowing. It was typing and imaging the incarnation of God, the eternal, the spiritual, appearing in, of all things, a thorn bush, the sign of the curse, as we ourselves in our bodies, because of the fall and because of our sin and our evil, bear the sign of the curse. But yet that thing which bore the sign of the curse, the thorn bush, was not consumed or destroyed by the presence of God. That's what the incarnation is. His full humanity, not destroyed by it. That's where heresies like Apollinarianism, which blend. Apollinarianism is basically, I often use hands to describe it because it's just an easy visual. This is the hypostatic union. This is the correct belief. Fully God, fully man, united. Right? But not intermingled. Yes. So that's with confusion, so intermingling. It's also not the humanity and the divinity where the divinity basically takes over the humanity to the point that the humanity becomes unrecognizable. That's Apollinarianism, right? So that's wrong. It's also not two completely different persons, and this is like schizophrenic Jesus. This is the divine Jesus. This is the human. That's called Nestorianism, right? And so that's also a problem. But that requires learning church history. That's all the early creeds, all the early confessions. That's what they were dealing with, all these problems.
At least they were trying in that early church to come to terms.
Trying, world level trying. Yeah.
And much as these souls in this room and many other souls besides are eternally grateful to evangelical Protestantism, which really came from...
Born out of the word evangelical comes from the Reformation,
Germany and Holland and England particularly.
Correct, yeah.
But the British Isles especially the British Isles. The the failure to discuss these fascinating things that Jesus himself talks about,
Jesus and the apostles talk about, yeah.
I blame the Scots for.
I know where you're going with this, and I'm partly sympathetic. Yeah,
the Scottish, though, very
and I love the Scots,
godly, very godly, and I really love the Scots for that reason.
I do too. Yeah,
are highly practical people.
Very, very, very.
And the word and the concept of transcendency frightens them.
Yes, it did. Yes, yes, and God bless them. I love the Scots as much as anyone else.
They're frightened of the transcendental and the mystical. They're very practical people.
Exactly, exactly. And the Church of Scotland is the origin of Presbyterianism, at least in its modern iteration. And God bless the Presbyterians. I love Presbyterians. They're our brothers and sisters in Christ. And Presbyterians have made no shortage of great advancement. They've been, large portions of America are built on the back of Presbyterianism, and the Church of Scotland had many great things about it. But it was the most intellectual wing of the Reformation. The Scottish Reformation was, and there are obviously a long list of things from the Scottish Reformation that I greatly appreciate. There are other things that I don't quite align with. But that's why, for example, you see the biggest form of iconoclasm is in Scotland. Now, Protestants have different opinions on iconoclasm. So iconoclasm is, in simple because I don't want to go into it because we need to get back to this, but the iconoclasm is basically how you treat Christian artwork. So a painting or a picture, or to use that Greek word icon of, say, St. Patrick, for example, right? The Celtic Christian who brought Christianity to Ireland, whose story is incredible, which I encourage you to go and read. Taken into slavery, was a slave of Irish pirates and Irish raiders for 6 years. Goes back to his native Britain, native Wales, inverted commas, not what it was called at that point, and then decides to actually, instead of living a life of bitterness and vengeance and hatred for his captors, for his slave owners, he instead actually goes back to Ireland to bring the gospel to the Irish. And this is how Ireland becomes Catholic Christianity, becomes Christian. This is how it becomes Christian. It's an incredible story, which you should definitely read. And so God bless Patrick. But having a picture of him, no matter how it's used at all, forgetting how it's used, because I as a Protestant, I disagree with veneration of icons. So praying to the type that the image is the prototype of, and it all gets a bit complex, and it's a whole history there that goes back to church councils, like the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Whole history there. But iconoclasm is the position that no icons or paintings or pictures or whatever you want to call them at all, even in just having it sitting in a library or a study or something, we need to destroy them all. So the Scottish Reformation was deeply iconoclastic. This is how St Andrew's Cathedral got burnt to the ground during the Reformation, unfortunately and sadly, because of the mob, which is what happens when mobs form. But that's the very intellectual wing of that. But when you get and this is, I talk about reason and logic all the time because they're important things. But when you become imbalanced and you try to do everything through the rung of logic and reason, everything through the rung of logic and reason, you miss the things that our logic and reason are limited in understanding. Okay, you are not going to be able to conceptualize, in its full extent, what on earth God being eternal means. Okay, it's beyond our ability to comprehend that within the dimensional world in which we live, which is finite. We are constrained by time. We are constrained by 1,000 different factors, and so the concept of what that means to be beyond time or separate from time, we don't have any ability to experientially know. Yeah, and so it limits us, and that's fine. But that's where the element of confidence, of trust, that's where genuine faith is. It's not blind faith. It's a faith in realizing that there is someone higher and beyond you who actually has this under control and who knows what's going on.
Faith.
Yeah, who knows what's going on. Yeah, the whole point of childlike faith is not about ignorance. The whole point of childlike faith is the kind of confidence and trust that a child has in their father, because their father has demonstrated that they've got this under control. Their father has demonstrated his bona fides, so it were, and they have confidence in their father, that their father is going to provide for them, their father is going to protect them, their father is going to do the right thing, that he's an honourable man, a loyal man, a good man.
Heal their cut.
Heal their cut.
Wound.
Yeah, exactly. Heal their wound. All those kinds of things, right? That's what the whole point is, and that's why the performance. And I'm not putting pressure on men, but the pressure's already there, so I'm not putting it on anyone. The duty, and well, really more than the duty, the performance of fathers in the household is the single biggest determiner of how
the health
of the household and how a child will turn out. Because don't get me wrong, mothers play an indispensably valuable role, but that's self-evident. I don't even just say that. It should be self-evident. But in terms of especially like in Christian households, whether that child will grow up to flourish in their faith and in their loyalty to Christ, we don't. It's not just speculative. Like, we kind of really do know that, especially from even the way, like with modern surveying and modern studies, like the faith and the loyalty, the honor, the integrity of the father is the biggest earthly determining factor. If dad goes off the rails, the children,
is not there,
or worse yet, is not there, it goes off the rails, and that's what we're currently suffering through. Yeah. Let's circle back here. So, verse 4. And some of them were persuaded. Well, let me touch on the other point I was going to make in verse 2, because I said once we got through that point in verse 3, I was going to make a point in verse 2. That it makes an interesting point here, and it's only a small one that I want to make. In verse 2, according to Paul's custom, he went to them for 3 Sabbaths, so 3 weeks in other words. Point 1 is that this is why my point at the very top about reading in context is really important, because if you just read this about Thessaloniki, you will think that Paul was only there for 3 weeks. Paul was actually there for 18 months, right? He's there for a long time, and that gets made apparent by the broader context of Scripture, and then also what those in the early church wrote about Paul. So taking the Scriptures and church history into account, we know that he's there for 18 months. He spends a sizable time in Thessaloniki, but if you just read it here, you'll see the 3 Sabbaths part, but that's him at the beginning. That's when they first arrive. Because now we've travelled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and they arrive there at Thessaloniki. But according to his custom, so this is the common model that Paul uses, where he arrives in a new city, in this case Thessaloniki, and goes where first? To the synagogue. Did he have to do it that way? No. That's his custom. And this is where I just want to make a brief point on the issue of custom or of different traditions in Christianity, is that there's obviously, and again, this should go without saying, but I'll make the point anyway. There are different tiers or kind of concentric circles of theological beliefs, right? There are dogmas. These are the essentials of the faith, and that would be a discussion as to what's in there. But even obvious things like, the Trinity, having a right understanding of who God is, having a right understanding of the incarnation, all those things are vitally important. The Scriptures, etc. And you work your way out from there to things that are more what we would call doctrines or second-tier doctrines, right? Things that are still really important and should not be minimized at all, but that Christians can come to unfortunate disagreements over while still remaining within the banner of the church. And then you move on to other kind of concentric circles, maybe third tier, if you'd like to call it that, which are different customs and traditions that are perfectly valid to have. The Apostle Paul, for himself, speaking of whom, addresses this, for example, in his letter to the Corinthians, the first one, where, especially on the days of who considers, having certain traditions around holy days. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, if one man considers this day holy and not another, then let him obey his conscience. If another does not consider that holy but a different day, or none at all, let him obey his conscience. Don't separate over these, right? And we just covered in our most recent church history class, when we were finishing the Apostolic Fathers, we were talking about Polycarp of Smyrna. One of the major events from Polycarp's life, who was Bishop of Smyrna in modern day Izmir in Turkey, on the west coast of Turkey there. One of the major events in his life was travelling to the Church of Rome and visiting with them to try and work out and negotiate basically a collaborative kind of agreement on when the dating of Easter should be. Because the tradition that had arisen in the Asian churches, so when we think Asia, we think of Asia as this giant continent over here. Asia back then was just basically what today we would call Turkey. Asia, in the east of Greece, at least. The Asian churches, so Smyrna, Philadelphia, Pergamum, etc., blah, 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 their custom was to celebrate it on the date of 14 Nisan, which is the 14th day of the new year, which is when the Passover, the date in which the Passover specifically occurs, right? So the date was what was important for them. And obviously, as you'd go through the date, that's going to change every single year what day that is, right? Okay. Whereas the custom that had arisen in the Western churches, like in Rome, for example, but other Western churches, was they kept to them the days were significant. So the Sunday being the day that Christ rose, right? And the whole significance of Christ rising on the quote unquote 8th day, right? The new day, and the whole typology between Christ, the Son of God, S-O-N, and Christ also being the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness, right? That whole play on words, right? Yeah, all that kind of stuff, right? So rising on the day of the sun, the new dawn, rising into a world of darkness, all that. So this is what's called the quarter-deciman controversy, which is a fancy name for it. Quarter-deciman means 14, so quarto, 4, deciman, 10, 14th. So the custom in the East was the date. The custom in the West was the day, which we still partake in, right? It's always, doesn't matter what day it is for us, it's always the first Sunday after the full moon of the spring equinox, right? Also for us, the autumn equinox. In the southern hemisphere, in the northern hemisphere would be the spring equinox. But the first Sunday after the full moon of the for us, autumn equinox. And so the day is what's important for the symbology of the day. Right? They come to a perfectly amicable agreement where they can't, the West still wants to keep it their way, but the East wants to keep it their way. They can't really reach a conclusion, because what's happened though is the basis is in the West, people like Paul and Peter, etc., with Rome, they've taught the day is what's it. They've taught the day, that's the cultural tradition which has come to them. But the most influential apostles in the East, in Asia, like John and Philip, they've taught the date. So the apostles have taught different customs in those places. And that's perfectly fine, because this is not something that determines whether you're, if I'm not celebrating, if you're not celebrating on the date, you're not doing it properly, and you're not really celebrating Christ's death, burial, and resurrection properly. You know what I mean? That's where we get to. And that's unfortunately, that ends up exploding 100 years later into what's called the quarter-deciman controversy, where a minority of bishops end up trying to excommunicate each other. It's a disaster. But fortunately, most of the bishops in the world actually get it right, like Irenaeus, and says, no, this is ridiculous. We shouldn't separate over customs, right? Different, you know what I mean? This is the whole point of Protestantism. You can have different customs. So Presbyterianism and Presbyterian churches have a different custom of church governance than Anglicans, which have a different custom of church governance than Baptists, which have a different governance than Presbyterian, you know what I mean? Yeah. And all of those, I would argue from church history, are valid forms of God. They're different customs. And that are built on the same basis, right? So all three of those models, congregationalism, right? So what Baptists have, Presbyterianism, what Presbyterians have, and what's called an Episcopal model, which is what Anglicans have, are all built on the same ultimate foundation, that there are deacons and then there are presbyters, which is where we get the word elder from, and presbyter, like Presbyterian. And then it's just a matter of how that ends up fleshing out, right? And all three can be valid forms of governance, that all three can have slightly different forms of governance, not wildly different, but slightly different forms of governance, and all still be under the Christian banner. Customs, all kinds of things. And so all the point I want to make is that would all of the apostles done it this way? Well, we don't know, but there's no reason. They could have done it differently. I mean, after all, the dating of Easter was done differently by different apostles. John and Philip in the East gave it on the date and taught the date. The Western apostles taught it on the day. Those are different customs, right? And it's perfectly acceptable to have different customs. Plenty of Christians, most Christians around the world, still maintain the historic practice of making the sign of the cross, right? The sign of the cross. And the way that looks in the East is, in the East, Christians will go from right to left. In the West, they'll go from left to right. Right, so left to right on yourself, for different reasons. The Eastern Christians do it from right to left, so that they're saying Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because the right side in the ancient world was always considered the side of righteousness and order, and this is why God's command to put the Shema in, for example. So the motto of the people of God, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. To put it on your forehead and on your right hand. The Lord says to my Lord in Psalm 110, sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool. You've heard the left side was the ancient peoples, including the Israelites, thought of the left side of the left of anything as evil, chaos, darkness, blah, blah, blah. So left-handed people were in for a rough time, unfortunately, like me. Right, left-handed. I'm ambidextrous, but I right left-handed, yeah. So I have some redeeming qualities because I can do things with both hands. So I'm not entirely chaotic and evil with my left-handedness. But yeah, so they say it for that reason. So they're saying Holy Spirit. The tradition and the custom in the West, and still plenty of Protestants also make the sign of cross. Lutherans, Anglicans, I do, where it's the movement of left to right. So the movement out of evil into good, the movement from chaos to order, from darkness to light. So all that's customs though. So should we stand around separating over whether you do it from right to left to right, or not at all?
What about transubstantiation?
Yeah, so that's where we move beyond custom. And so now that's a good point. So that's where you move beyond custom. So the basic move beyond custom into an actual theology of the incarnation itself.
Is it primary or secondary doctrine in your opinion?
The transubstantiation in a basic sense, if I just take it in isolation, purely in isolation, it is an extremely high order secondary doctrine that really is bordering on dogmatic. But in a genuine sense, if I take it in isolation, it is on paper, and I'm willing to say this as a Protestant. If taken in isolation on paper, it's a secondary doctrine. But
it's a difficult one.
Yeah, but this is why you can't take anything in isolation, because the issue of the Reformation was not just over transubstantiation. It's transubstantiation, purgatory, veneration of icons. So not just the presence of icons, but the way that they're used. So praying to the prototype of the icon. So prayers to the saints, for example, as opposed to singularly to God. And again, the Roman Catholic explanation of that, there is an answer that they attempt to give, which is one that I disagree with. But that's a whole
works and sacraments versus faith.
Correct. Well, the whole sacramental system, what's called the sacerdotal system of the propagation of sacraments. Very clear in the early church, there was only 2, and that ends up growing into a list of 7. All these kinds of various things. So this is the Reformation was absolutely needed, 100%. I'm Protestant by conviction, not by convenience. But I also recognise, as Protestants should, unfortunately a number of people don't really, but the Christian church didn't die off for 1,000 years and then was like reborn in the Reformation. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of Christians end up treating it, unfortunately, because they end up looking at the medieval church and going, oh, that was just all that Roman Catholic stuff. But it's not. The term Roman Catholicism doesn't even necessarily make sense until like the year 1054, when the Great Schism happens between the East and the Western churches. So Alfred the Great in the 9th century, for example, wasn't a Roman Catholic because there was no such thing as Roman Catholic. It didn't exist. There was no such thing as Eastern Orthodox either. There was just
Catholic.
The churches. There was just Catholic. That's my whole point about Catholic, and that's why we've explained before. That's why I don't whitewash the word Catholic from the creeds, because that is, if you went back and talked to any of the church fathers who are so vitally important, what would they say to you? I'm a Catholic, because the word Catholicos means universal. I'm part of the true church. I'm not part of the heretics like the Arians. Those they've moved away, and they now say that Jesus isn't God, and all these other fanciful doctrines, right? Which they can't back up from the scriptures, but they're actually taking from their vision of Jesus is far more like Apollo than it is of the actual Jesus. And so all these kinds of things, and so Catholic Christianity. That's the whole point of why it's called Roman Catholicism, because the problem with what Rome's been doing for about, let's call it 800 years, progressively, not all the same. Rome 800 years ago was in a much better place than it is now, unfortunately. And I pray and I long for the day when she comes to her senses. But the problem is that Rome, by the time you get to the High Medieval period, by the time you get to about the year 1000 AD and beyond, is asserting itself, the Roman Church, as the form of universal Christianity, and that people who are in anyone who's in opposition to her on, certainly on essential things, but let alone anything else, has actually abandoned the faith, right? So that's the problem. The problem is not with the term Catholic, the problem is with the term Roman Catholic, because it's the claim that the Church of Rome's way of doing things is the Catholic way. But the problem is that you can demonstrate very clearly from history that it's not the way, because Rome has 1,000 different beliefs that are not what that is. So, fortunately, the rest of the passage finishes off pretty nicely for us, and then there's one overarching point that we make from it, okay? So, in verse 4, some of them were persuaded, some of the group that they were talking to, okay? They were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas along with a great multitude of God-fearing Greeks, right? So we've encountered them plenty of times before, and not a few of the leading women. So again, the fact that the new covenant is expansive in its scope, okay, and the Gospels and the Book of Acts make that plain, okay. Verse 5: but the Jews, becoming jealous, as we saw. Exactly, well, we've seen 1,000 different times, but we saw it particularly in the last chapter. But the Jews becoming jealous, and these are not the ones who believe, this is the ones who reject, okay, who reject for the same reasons that they've been rejecting for decades now. But the Jews becoming jealous, taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, from the agora, right? So these would be, again, wealthier men, these are merchants, these are guys in positions of at least social influence. Yeah. So same playbook, right? The Jews marrying up, quote unquote, to powerful and wealthy individuals to then influence what? Oh, a mob, forming a mob. So power and wealth and power tied at the hip, inciting a mob, right? Verse 5, and forming a mob, set the city in uproar. It's exactly what we saw last week, right? Or in the last weeks, in the last chapter, right? Yeah, it's the exact same thing. The wealthy, powerful elite whipping up a mob in order to get something done. They set the city in an uproar, and attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out of the assembly. So this Jason is the one who obviously the house in whom the church was meeting. Okay, this is centuries before Christians have the liberty and the freedom and the protection to be able to build dedicated church buildings. The church buildings were houses. And they were seeking to bring them out of the assembly. That's the ecclesia, the church. Verse 6, and when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the world, the oikumene, the inhabited world, have come here also. So they already knew exactly who Paul and co were. They'd heard the stories from Philippi. They'd probably heard stories from elsewhere. They may have even heard the stories from Asia. They may have heard stories from as far, who knows how far away. They clearly know they've been elsewhere. So it's entirely possible they already know what's gone on in even places many chapters earlier, like Derbe and Lystra, back in what today is central Turkey, right in Galatia. That's years ago at this point. So they know about this because they're making the people who upset the whole world. Everyone knows that their claim, like the very plenary, widespread claim, their point that they're making here. They've come here also, so they knew exactly who Paul and stuff were when they rolled into Thessaloniki. They knew exactly who they were, right? Verse 7: and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Now this is an extremely important point. Because this is one of the bedrock reasons for the judgment that comes upon them in the first century, which is that notice what their primary objection is. Notice that their primary objection has absolutely nothing, at least on any meaningful level, to do with Scripture.
No.
It has nothing to do with theology. It has nothing to do with these men are false teachers who are twisting the word of God. No. These are Jews saying. These people are saying that there's some other king other than our beloved Caesar. It's not. It's not. It's just the destruction and the annihilation of Jerusalem. That whole judgment which Christ said was coming upon them for this very reason, was so eminently deserved. That ironically, the very ones whom they had essentially on not just a political level, but even on a spiritual level, practically prostituted themselves to, hence the kind of verbiage that we find along the language along those lines. brings the kind of judgment and wrath against them for this very reason, right? They are wholesale devoted themselves to the entire Roman imperial system, and they live on they're happy with the nice little happy medium. They don't have to worship the Roman gods because they were like the Jews were practically the only people in the empire that had an exemption from that. So they don't have to worship the Roman gods, so that allows them to think that they're still being faithful to the covenant. But as long as they're wholesale devoted to the Caesar, then Rome's good. And they're good with it too. So Rome's good with that. Rome will allow them to not worship the Roman gods or the state gods of Rome, so they can, which everyone else had to. People died for not doing that, like Christians, but other people too. So they don't have to worship the Roman gods as long as they maintain wholesale devotion to the emperor. Then they're golden, as far as Rome's concerned. And they are perfectly happy with that arrangement. Perfectly happy. It's hilarious.
Nothing really has changed. I mean, clearly, when the Lord talks about the synagogue of Satan in a passage such as Revelation 3:20, I think.
Yes.
Clearly, in my humble view, he's talking about these Jews we're talking about here, who proclaim knowledge of the scrolls.
Yeah. We have the scribes and the rabbis.
Reject.
Yeah, exactly. Reject the truth of it, 100%.
And they've married themselves wholeheartedly
Correct.
to the world and the mercantile system. Nothing has changed, in my humble view, in 2,000 years, because when you look at the Hollywood Jewish
gigantic
hierarchy,
influence. Yeah, gigantic influence.
They call themselves Jews.
Yeah, and on the ethnic sense they are. But here's the thing, though, is that the New Testament is that, and this is where. And this is,
or the New York Jews or whatever, I'm not singling out.
No, exactly.
I'm just saying it grieves me when I see anti-Semitism on the rise, because I spend a lot of time on alternative social media platforms, and the amount of anti-Semitism on there is stomach churning, and it's growing. And it's growing because this sect of Jews still exists.
That is what Judaism is. Judaism. These are the theological, not just ethnic, but theological ancestors of Judaism. That's the entire premise, and that's why it's the balance. So hatred and bitterness and vile behaviour or semantics or etc. against Jews for nothing more than their ethnicity is obviously wrong. That kind of goes without saying, because the same thing could be said of anyone. hating African people for that same reason is equally wrong. Hating Europeans for that reason. Anything on the ethnic or racial lines, like racism as a genuine sense of, especially in like its 19th century definition of like scientific racism or the precursors to eugenics that we saw from the 20th century, all of that's born out of an ungodly perspective of who human beings are. And ironically, I'm not trying to circle back to the same points we began with even before this study, but scientific racism only works in an evolutionary worldview.
Absolutely.
Do you understand? It doesn't work in a worldview where we all actually have a common ancestor we know their names, right? So when all the mankind is, and we're going to see that by the time we get through to the rest of it, when you get further down in chapter 17 here, one of the most famous speeches in all of the scriptures is Paul's address to the Areopagus in Athens. Couldn't be in a more famous setting if he tried, and he gives one of the most famous speeches in all of biblical history. And he mentioned that exact point that all the nations of earth are descended from one man, right? Now it's one man and one woman, right? From Adam and Eve. That destroys the concept of racism, annihilates it. That's why it destroys the concept, because all we are various ethnicities, which is ethnos. The ethno means nation. That's the Greek word for nations. We're just different nations of people with different customs, different cultures, with varying amounts of the exact same pigment, melanin. You've got people like me who have very little, by virtue of my Anglo-Celtic ancestry. You've got people who couldn't have more melanin if they tried, from the Sudan, and God bless them. And it's all just the exact same shade. It's just literally just varying levels of brown. And so even concepts like ridiculous hang-ups that the Americans still have, where of descriptions about white, black, Asian, all these different that just make no actual, real, genuine sense. But see, all of that is born out of the hang-up of the evolutionary worldview. Now, the fundamental thing, though, is that on the flip side of that is that, unfortunately, what happens is that any even vague criticism of things like Judaism get automatically swung into the bin of anti-Semitism, where you become unquestionable, and that can't happen either, right? Because otherwise, the New Testament is patently anti-Semitic, if that's your definition. It's not, though, because so you mentioned Pergamum earlier. That's the place where he says, I know where the synagogue of Satan is, where Satan has his throne, right? Because Pergamum had the biggest imperial cult outside of Rome in the world. Okay, so the throne element, right? Even earlier on in, I think it's either Smyrna or Thyatira, I can't remember which one it is. He talks about, I know the persecution you have faced at the hands of those who call themselves Jews but are not. Right. So that's Jesus, a Jew, saying that those who reject me are not true Jews, because the real Jews have accepted me.
That's your dividing line.
That's the dividing line. But see, imagine if I just said that kind of out of that would be classed today as anti-Semitism, even though that's the words of Jesus, who's a Jew. So Jesus, a Jew, is anti-Semitic. Like, how does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. Like, you know what I mean? That's the point. And so the whole point is, it's not about the ethnicity. The important point is the allegiance. It's the religion. That's the element. That's why Paul's able to say in Romans chapter 9 that the belief. Yeah. Got to go, yeah, that's fine, perfectly fine, yeah, absolutely. Have a good day. No, you're right, have a good day. That all those who are, that not all those who call themselves Israel are of Israel, right? So not all those who are ethnically Israelites are actually of Israel, because Israel is the one who is loyal to God. That's why it's the one tree in Romans chapter 11, or two chapters later. There's not two trees. There's not a Jewish tree, like ethnically a Jewish tree, and a Greek Gentile tree. No, it's the one tree in this symbolism that Paul's using. There are branches that have been cut off, those who have rejected the Messiah, even though all the evidence is staring them in the face.
Even though they're the olive, originally part of the olive tree.
Correct.
They've been cut off.
Correct. And then other branches have been grafted in, which is just a horticultural term, right? And that's the Greeks, the Gentiles, or anyone of any ethnicity that's not Jewish, who have been grafted. But it's the one tree. So when you say that, so on a functional level, it's not my opinion, it's Jesus' opinion, it's Paul's opinion, that Israel is the church and the church is Israel. Those are one and the same thing, right? There are ethnic Jews, but those who reject Christ and reject what's staring them in the face from the Old Testament, let alone the New, are not part of Israel. They're ethnically Jewish, but the whole point of the New Covenant is the breaking down of the division ethnically, right? That's why Paul's able to say, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor free, slave. So male nor female, slave nor free. Not that those categories don't actually exist, because obviously they're still men and women. Even in his day, they're still slave and free today. They're still slave and free, still slave today. So there's ethnic things. There's still people who are Greek, and your ethnic background is different to my specific ethnic background. And that's still reality, but the division that is caused religiously or spiritually is gone. So men and women are not on different footings in Christ, because we're both made in the image of God. Slave master and slave are no longer divided, as is the whole point in essence of slavery. They're united. So that's why you get letters like those written in the New Testament to Philemon. And that whole ordeal is over a slave master and a slave who have both converted to Christianity. Difficult. and how they're to work that out, and how they're to negotiate this, and how they're to go about it, and blah blah blah.
Not easy thing.
No, difficult, because they've both been in their position before Christianity, and now they both convert to Christianity. So now what do we do? Do you understand? And that's the whole point. And same with the Jew and the Greek, right? The Jew and the Gentile, any ethnicity.
The horticultural analogy you mentioned is fascinating, because Jesus himself said that the wild olive is grafted into the natural olive.
The natural, yeah.
There is a wild olive tree, and its leaves are much thinner than the fruit-bearing.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
the standard fruit-bearing olive tree,
which
was around in Jesus' time, and which is used to harvest the olives.
Yep.
which are then either eaten or crushed
Often crushed
for their oil.
Yeah, for oil. Yeah.
Now, you can graft the wild olive.
You can.
It's a significantly different looking tree.
Yes.
You can graft a branch of that.
But you can do it horticulturally, though. Yeah.
The natural olive, and it'll live.
It will. Yeah, 100%. Exactly. But that's the point of those analogies. The whole point of any analogy in the scriptures is it's meant to be communicating something so that people can understand what it's meant to be saying. It's not meant to be.
Here's another I don't know the answer to this. Was the tree that Jesus referred to as the natural olive tree, the one which produces the fruit from which the olive oil comes, was that a cultivar? Was that a cultivated, tame tree which humankind cultivated from the wild olive? Or were they always parallel? Was there always a wild olive and always a fruit-bearing, oil-bearing olive? I don't know the answer.
Who knows? Without a time machine,
I don't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, do we have an answer to that? I don't know.
There may be archaeological answers to that, but that would be us engaging in archaeology for those kinds of reasons.
That would be a fascinating
But when this is exactly, but even still, no matter, it would be fascinating, you're right. But the basic premise of the analogy still works either way. But it still works even if we just explain that that's what's going on.
But it would be even more fascinating if there were always a wild and there were always a fruit and oil bearing one. That would make it really interesting.
Correct.
Because
the symbology would be more important.
That the Greeks were always, the barbarians were always out there, just waiting to be grafted into the oil.
And that would make more sense of the way in which it gets discussed. Yeah, exactly. And all these things are human beings are intricately tied to symbolism, and we think in symbolic terms all the time. Symbolism always has value meaning. I mean, we live in a culture drowning in symbolism. That's what corporate logos are. They're symbols. So we sports teams and their logos and they're this and they're that. All these things are symbols. They're all symbols.
Jesus used the wine press analogy. He uses the vineyard analogy. He uses analogy after analogy.
Correct. It's God communicating to us in ways that we actually are able to comprehend and that we can know from experience, that we can see. And if that happened today, there'd be if just pretend in a hypothetical that everything you read about in the Gospels actually just happened now in our time, you'd have all kinds of technological analogies. It'd be the same thing. And how that would work, I wouldn't have a clue, but you'd make all kinds of technological analogies. And so, but the point here is that the whole point of acting, they're not even using the scriptures at all. It's just, he's acted contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king. Because for the Jews at this point, they only had one king, and their king was Caesar. And by conviction, not just begrudgingly. No, our king is Caesar. Even though they're meant to be looking for the king of the Jews. The king of kings, yeah. It's such blasphemy, yeah. It's almost beyond comprehension. And so, that's fundamentally, and this really speaks to the heart of what the real fundamental reason was why Rome persecuted Christians, pagan Rome, because at the end of the day, no matter what, they're not worshipping the Roman god. That wasn't the real reason. The Romans charged them with atheism, but that was merely often a cover. The real core, the heart of the issue as to why Rome went so hard against Christianity for the first 300 years before then eventually Rome converts to Christianity is at the end of the day, they had another king. At the end of the day, these people, these Christians, this cult, are saying that there's a higher authority than the emperor.
Amazing that those days will come again according to Scripture.
Well, no matter what you believe eschatologically, those days are already here in basic forms anyway. But that's the whole problem we're dealing with. We are run by a consortium of people who act because they do not see any higher authority than themselves. That's the entire point. Like it's not. That's why again, it's not Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists who get shut down. It's not Jews who gets silenced on social media, who get cancelled from their job, who get cancelled social media, cancelled this, who get fired from jobs, disciplined, have to do retraining, all these kind of things. No, it's Christians. Why? Because who are the only people on earth who are saying that there is a greater and higher authority above us? Us. We're the ones. It's not the Buddhists. It's not the Hindus. It's not even the Jews. The Jews should be on a theological level, but they don't, because they're just doing it's the same premise they're doing here. They're completely in bed with it. It's the Christians who are saying that there is a king of kings. There is a king over other kings. There is a king over the rules of the earth. And that's what the ultimate threat is. It's a higher authority to whom you are accountable to. And that is the bane of all those who are filled with pride and hubris and arrogance. And that's it's the same, nothing's new, it's the same principle. And so as a result, they disturbed the crowd, they whipped up the crowd into a frenzy as it was, and the city authorities who had heard these things. And when they received the bond from Jason and others, they released them. So they drag them through the streets, as they say in verse 6, they beat them up and then release them on bond. So no imprisonment. So again, the same mistreatment, and then release them. So no actual charge, no trial, they get released on a bond with no punishment, no imprisonment. So again, beating them up, dragging them through the streets, and then the same kind of trying to sweep under the rug that we saw in the greater ordeal with Paul and co back up in Philippi. Same thing, it's just a train wreck. This is why, by the way, and I'll finish on this point, this is why Paul spends basically the entire second chapter of 1 Thessalonians explaining, which he writes not long after this to the Thessalonians, basically doing it, and he does it well, justifying himself to the Thessalonians that he wasn't just someone coming in as a grifter or a charlatan, because basically what's happened here, Paul is rolling in, Paul and the other apostles, they've come into Thessaloniki. They have they've built up the church, they've taught it, etc., etc., etc. And then it's ended in this way, with them having to flee the city, and Jason and others who are obviously remaining as part of the church there ended up having to undergo this, and then Jason ended up having to pay a bond, some money, to free him and the other Christians who had been in prison. So Paul spends, you can go read it, Paul spends the entire, the second chapter of Thessalonians. I'll just read part of it for you. Where should I begin? Yeah, so Paul, I'll go through verses 1 and 12, just read it to you. It's fairly self-explanatory. So Paul says in the second chapter of 1 Thessalonians, who's writing to them not long after this, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our entrance to you was not in vain, but after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi," which is what we saw last in chapter 16, "as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much struggle. For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit," right? So he's trying to justify, we didn't come into the city just to deceive you and to get money, to take money and just run off. No. "But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not in order to please men, but for God who examines our hearts." Okay, so he's justifying, and rightly so, justifying that we're not charlatans, not grifters, right? Just because it turned out this way, right? For we never came with a flattering word, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is our witness. For seeking glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles in Christ we could have been a burden to you. Okay? But we proved to be gentle among you, like a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. In this way, having had fond affection for you, we were pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become beloved to us. Okay, can you see what he's doing here? Right? He's explaining we didn't come for greed, because what could have been left in their minds is he's been there for 18 months, building up the church, teaching them constantly from the scriptures, etc., building the place up. And then it ends with the Jews getting in league with wealthy merchants, whipping a mob up into a frenzy, and then expelling Paul and co, imprisoning Jason and those who had remained, obviously because they're from there, and then they have to pay a bond. So Jason was obviously financially wealthy enough to pay for that. It also makes sense because it's his house. Christians, to hold that many people, you needed to meet in a large house, yeah, a large doma, a large domicile. And you needed to have obviously money to do that. So wealthy Christians were the ones who were providing as benefactors for where Christians could meet. So he obviously had money. That's why he pays the bond for himself and for others. So Paul desperately doesn't want Jason or the other church members there to think that
He abandoned them.
Yeah, exactly. He abandoned them, or that he was a burden to them because he had to flee because they're probably going to kill him, or do what they tried to do to him in Philippi, which was eventually kill him,
and left them carrying the can.
Yeah, that's just the way that it unfortunately felt. But Paul doesn't want them to be confused as to thinking. That's why he says, "Our entrance to you was not in vain." We didn't come by way of deceit. We never came with a flattering word, right, like a charlatan trying to schmooze you out of money, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is our witness, right? That's why he's saying this, okay? And so that's why he spends a good bulk of the second chapter to his letter to them just after this, explaining that. And so that's where the Thessalonian. So the Thessalonian church has a very long time. It has 18 months, roughly speaking, with the Apostle Paul. Sizable time. It's built up in the house of Jason, and then has the apostles have to flee from there because
it gets raided.
And then they get raided by the authorities. They then probably have wealth and property stolen from them. The bond they probably had to pay was probably grossly overvalued anyway, so they're probably stealing from them in that sense too, we're told. But Jason has to foot the bill for getting them out of prison through a bond. And so it seems like, it ends in a rocky fashion, but not really, because that church is still there to this day. And that church continues, that church grows and flourishes from that point under persecution. But Luke here is recounting how it begins and then recounts the major kind of climactic events of the apostles having to flee in the face of persecution. And so that's why it's always important to read in context, because you can then read Paul's 2 letters to the Thessalonians.
It would have been difficult for Paul and Silas and the others to flee because they know that the Remainers, the locals, Jason, his household, the other believers who are from Thessaloniki, they would have paid the price. So it would have been
that's what they did. They literally paid the price.
Paul. It would have been, he would have been
that's the entire point.
Really torn.
That's my point. And you see that, that's why I cross-reference 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, because that's what he's pouring his heart out. He's demonstrating really clearly about how it's not like Paul's done anything wrong. The whole point why he's fleeing is because he knows he's not an idiot. If the authorities got a hold of him here, they weren't going to make the same. The only reason he escaped from Philippi is because of a miraculous event. Because otherwise, if that didn't happen, Paul's dead. That's the implication.
The Lord wants him alive at this stage.
That's my point. People need to connect the dots here and just use their brain. If that doesn't happen, what we saw in the last chapter in Philippi, Paul's dead at the end of that equation. Do you know what I mean? Paul's going to be beheaded, right, as a Roman citizen. That's what's going to happen to him. So if he gets captured here again, he doesn't use God as a vending machine. He's not going to bank on God saving twice. That's not the issue though. So he can't afford to be captured here. So he has to flee, and that's fine. That makes sense. He has to flee, but he does so with pain because the Thessalonian Christians are still in Thessaloniki and they're remaining there, and so that's why he.
And they're going to be beaten and imprisoned.
As they were, and then extorted for way more money, having to pay some exorbitant bond that was probably unjust in the first place.
And I'm laughing. I mean, this is serious.
No, I know, but that's
I wouldn't want to undergo that.
Oh, I know, but that's the bedrock of the church. So if you want more information, just read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and you'll see how Paul, because he continues on beyond what I just read there in verses 1 through 8.
Of course, Paul saw the hand of God in all of this, and he was trying to impart to the Thessalonians, Thessalonians, the same thing, that it's actually God's will that they be persecuted. It's a very hard message to swallow for a Christian, for anyone.
Especially for the moderns, that God protects and actually builds you, and you grow stronger through it, because you grow stronger through trial. You grow stronger through. People don't grow through comfort; they grow through difficulty. Any athlete understands that on a basic level.
That's true.
You don't grow in your athletic performance by sitting on the couch and doing nothing. You grow by training. You grow through discipline, and so it's the same concept. And that's why the persecution's been going on for 2,000 years. It'll keep going on around the world, but in places that are not predominantly Christian, certainly. But the early church is so heavy in persecution because it's almost like it had to be, to build it up and to grow it in. And that sounds so odd because that's That's not the typical way that the religions of the world tend to think. It's actually the opposite.
It's counterintuitive.
It's completely counterintuitive. Islam's the polar opposite of this. Islam, for example, is the archetypal antithesis of this, where Islam doesn't grow under persecution. Islam grows by persecuting.
By the sword.
By sword. Islam's growth, almost every single territory you see today, with the sole exception of Indonesia and Bhutan, which is right there, obviously, near Indonesia. Every other place, all throughout the Middle East, North Africa, all of that was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate and by the Abbasids,
Syria.
etc. Blah, 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 all those places. Yeah, correct. By the Rashidun Caliphate, then the Umayyad Caliphate, before they eventually settled down and formed the Abbasid Caliphate. But the Rashiduns and the Umayyads, in the first 100 years essentially of Islam, conquer 11 million square kilometres and build the largest empire the world's ever seen through the sword. So Islam doesn't grow. Islam didn't grow under persecution. Islam grew by persecuting. It grew by rolling into North Africa and going, you have two options. You can either remain who you are, a Christian, for example, and you will live under our dominion and you will pay the jizya, the tax, the infidel tax for not being a Muslim, or you can convert to or you can convert to Islam. And if you don't do either of those options, you'll face death.
Really,
That's the
Roman
maxim.
Empire did
Exactly
to
the
the early
same.
Christians.
Correct, yeah. Or to anyone. That's exactly the same maxim that Rome used, or just about anyone, but especially Rome. You submit to our rule, you can keep your customs and your traditions as long as you honour the emperor and incorporate that.
If you pay us.
And you pay tax, and you are a civilized person, and you don't break Roman law, etc. If you refuse those options, you die.
We're essentially there now.
We're getting there, yeah. We're getting there.
Let's say
we're heading in that direction if we keep going for another couple of decades this way.
If the American administration takes away the
501c3
C3
charitable status, yeah.
charitable status of churches in the United States of America, they will bow down to Caesar.
That's the choice they'll face. Yeah, America already does this in foreign policy. Was it Zambia, Namibia? An African nation very recently brought in new legislation regarding family and public indecency and sexuality and all such things. I think it was the Zambians. I can't remember. The Americans utterly lambasted them for it. Just took them to task through the State Department of the United States for daring to have a different morality of sexuality than the current American government does. And this hilarious notion of how the West is constantly excoriated for imperialism hundreds of years ago. Meanwhile, the very same people who excoriate the imperialism of the British and the Spanish hundreds of years ago turn around and act entirely imperial in regards to the Africans, right? Where you think, or the Middle East, or in the Middle East, where you think that you can fly the rainbow flag atop the embassy in Kabul and think that somehow the Afghanis, the Pashtuns, that is to say, are going to accept you. Are you out of your mind? You're kidding me. Like how blindingly ignorant do you have to be? Why is it that Zambia in Africa or anywhere else has to be lectured by the United States government about morality as if you have any leg to stand on? Are you kidding me? All these kinds of things. But so they already do that in regards to foreign policy. If a country doesn't get on board with America's political, like literally just their philosophy of sexuality, if a country doesn't get on board, then the Americans do not act favourably toward you at all. That already that's been going on for 10 plus years. That already happens, and that's before we even start talking about more consequential things like actual religious issues. Yeah. So that's what happens when you're just like this, when there's no higher authority than yourself, and that's what happens when you remove the authorities, be they political or especially religious, right, spiritual, where there's no accountability. You don't fear reprisal from anyone above you, and you are literally on top of the food chain as far as you're concerned. And when you allow yourself to slip into that mindset or into that worldview, destruction and tyranny follow. Yeah. That's the whole point here. The Jews aren't making a biblical argument. They're appealing to the Romans, the pagans, saying these people have the audacity to say that there's a higher authority than Caesar. Like the concept of that coming out of the mouth of the Jews in the first, it's terrifying. It's terrifying because and you know exactly what I mean. It's a terrifying thought because, like, the history of the Israelites in the Old Testament is constantly being assailed against by foreign pagan nations: the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Philistines, etc., etc., etc. And the constant exhortation on God's part: remain faithful to the covenant, remain faithful, remain faithful. And they've devolved to a point here, spiritually, like religiously, where now they're so wedded to the Roman Empire that their primary concern is that these other Jews, Paul and Silas, who are all like fellow Jews, they're dobbing out their fellow Jews to the pagans, to the Romans, for daring to say that there's a higher authority than Caesar. It's terrifying. Terrifying because of the consequences of that, like spiritually, the consequences of you've abandoned everything your ancestors ever stood for. You've abandoned everything that they hoped for. Your ancestors lived and died looking forward and their only hope in life was this very Jesus, this very Christ, this very Messiah. That's who they looked forward to. That's who they put their hope and their trust in for salvation. And you're just spitting on it. It's just, such as it was. Plenty of Jews converted in the first century, became Christians. They followed through on what their ancestors had long hoped for. They saw the clear evidence that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. So it's a whole point there in the end of verse 3, right? This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is that very Christ, is that very Savior, that very Messiah, that very King. This is how it ends. So anyway, next week we move into their time in Berea, where they have, and they fortunately find Jews with an entirely different disposition and response in a much more positive direction. So we'll cover that in our next lesson. All right? Thank you.